we found some other things on the hill. Well, we didn't find them. They had been found. And they were all on a PDF that we were sent by Shropshire Museums, and there were fossils that looked like dragon scales. I was really excited about those, but they were plants. There were ferns, and there were the axe heads that Lily Chitty had mentioned, and so we thought, axe heads, I'd love to get my hands on those axe heads. And so we asked at and yes, apparently they were at the Ludlow Museum Resource Centre, so we tried to arrange a day to go there, and oh no, we're closed for refurbishment. Oh, okay. Then we found out they weren't actually at Ludlow. One of them was at Shrewsbury, and we could go up there to look at them both. Great. But the Severn flooded her banks, and there was no in or out of Shrewsbury at that time. So then we thought, oh, well, that's fine. We'll just rearrange it for a few weeks' time. Then lockdown happened. So
we never got to see the axes.
And I don't think we'd better try either. No. Just in case there's some other biblical disaster happens. I think they shall remain in legend forever.
But they wandered around for years.
Mislabelled. Oh well. There was something else on that PDF though. There was a bird, a very rare visitor to Shropshire.
A squawky heron?
No, squarko heron. Not a squawky heron.
Well, if you've been wandering on Clee Hill in the summer of 1834, you might have heard that sound. And then you might have spotted the bird that made it, and here it is. It's the squarko heron. Very, very unusual sighting. In fact, the first sighting of a squarko heron in Shropshire on Clee Hill in 1834. Whatever brought it here, maybe it was a very hot summer, or maybe it was blown off course, but normally it would only be found in winter in Africa, and then it would fly north to southern Europe where it would have its breeding season, and it wouldn't normally be seen outside that range. So a very, very rare visitor indeed. It wasn't really a very good day for it when it arrived, because the first person that saw it shot it dead. And as was the custom in those days, if you weren't going to eat it and it was something unusual, you would hurry along to the taxidermist and get it stuffed and put on a plinth. Very sad. But this bird still exists in Shrewsbury Museum. Here it is on its plinth. The taxidermist wouldn't have seen one before, obviously. Maybe in a book, perhaps. But wouldn't have realised that, generally speaking, they wouldn't have the neck stretched out like this. It wouldn't be a natural pose for it. This more hunched appearance is more natural for the squarko heron. Of course, they can stretch the neck out, but if you were going to represent one, you probably wouldn't do that. But anyway, there it was, and I expect it was on the sideboard, and it was a very exciting thing to show visitors. The only thing that I can find out about it, I found in a book called The Diary of a Shropshire Farmer, A Young Yeoman's Life and Travels, 1835 to 1337, by Peter Davis. And in this book is mentioned a George Henry Dancy. He was an attorney of Broad Street, Ludlow, and apparently he owned a rare stuffed squarko heron. Well, surely this must be the same one. The Dancy family owned 7,500 acres in Herefordshire, but only about 30 miles from Clee Hills. So I'm presuming it would be too much of a coincidence that this wasn't the case. A very sad end for a very beautiful bird.
One notable thing about Shropshire is that it has field name maps. Mr. Foxall was working with Margaret Gelling on the place names of Shropshire in the 1970s, and he undertook the task of making field name maps from the tithe apportionment of the 1800s and from the OS maps that showed the field layouts. And he wrote a book about it because they all had names. Some of them were called close or meadow or just the field, but a lot of them had very intriguing names. And so what he did, he wrote a book called Shropshire Field Names, strangely enough, and in it he tried to say what the names might mean. And I was intrigued by this. I think it was your granddad who had a copy of the Corley Field map, and I was like, what? They have names?
All these fields have names.
All these fields have names, you know. It began as a poem. First of all, it was going to be a poem of field names and interpretations, and then the ukulele happened. And it became a song. And buts and reens, and Mr. Foxall wrote a book on what the names might mean. All the fields have names, you know, he wrote it with intent, making Shropshire's field maps from the tithe apportionment. In pasty crust the soil's too dry, in pudding bag too wet, hard bargains like the names suggest, and rough's not been touched yet. Riley's meadow grows you rye, Pell Brains has been grazed bare, Tumpy Peace has anthills, Eccles finds his harvest there. All these fields have names, you know, these blacks and buds and reens, and Mr. Foxall wrote a book on what the names might mean. All the fields have names, you know, he wrote it with intent, making Shropshire's field maps from the tithe apportionment. Thistley Close is good for bussocks, the Fakes no good for hay. Brazen Held's a pebbly slope, like cat's brains so they say. The stockings left with tree stumps, the Wintles is exposed. The loons and doles were open strips before they were enclosed. All these fields have names, you know, these blacks and buds and reens, and Mr. Foxall wrote a book on what the names might mean. All the fields have names, you know, he wrote it with intent, making Shropshire's field maps from the tithe apportionment. How long it takes to work a field, all on the name depends. 12 days ploughing, 4 days math, long Friday never ends. Bottle's bank grows marigolds, there's food in kitchen meadow, in Diggins pit there's coprolite, to fertilise the lezo. All these fields have names, you know, these plaques and buds and reens, and Mr. Foxall wrote a book on what the names might mean. All the fields have names, you know, he wrote it with intent, making Shropshire's field maps from the tithe apportionment. Jack's yard belongs to no one, and Mingan is disputed. Between two farms contention for the Strut meadow is rooted. Thursley's named after a giant, young hares play at Monkey's Fold. Serpent Coppice was named after the old pub, or so I'm told. All these fields have names, you know, these blacks and buds and reens, and Mr. Foxall wrote a book on what the names might mean. All the fields have names, you know, he wrote it with intent, making Shropshire's field maps from the tithe apportionment. All these fields have names, you know, these plaques and buds and reens, and Mr. Foxall wrote a book on what the names might mean. All the fields have names, you know, he wrote it with intent, making Shropshire's field maps from the tithe apportionment. Mr. Foxall's field maps were made parish by parish, and they showed the boundary of the parish on each map, and on some of them there are markers. For example, on the Cawley one there's the muster hole, which was the meeting place of the 100, which was basically the equivalent of the parish council, and they would meet in a specific place, in this case the muster hole, and they would talk about the business of the parish, talk about, oh, so and so's built a barn there, should we let it stand, that kind of thing. And in ancient times they would have voted by sword, because if you had a sword and were a good Christian man, you were allowed to go to these meetings. But sadly the muster hole has now been quarried away, so where it was is now a big muster hole of a quarry. We looked into beating the bounds of the parish. Now this was something that was done annually to re-establish boundaries of the parish or the estate. So we had this idea that we wanted to have a song that travelled round the boundary of the parish, and we found out that in Anglo-Saxon times, when they beat the bounds, they went round in a clockwise manner, and it had them going from a certain oak tree to a ditch, and then by somebody's gate down to the ford. And so we looked on these parish maps, and we looked, and there's still fords, there's still places where stream and pathway cross, and there were these old boundary markers, and we actually found some of them up on the hill. There's the stooping stone. There's also the three-forked pole. The three-forked pole is one of the Clee Hill landmarks, really, and a lot of people think that is actually a marker between parishes, but it's not on the old map. It's on the old Ordnance Survey map, but it's not on the old field maps, because it's not on the boundary. It's a few metres inside the boundary, but it's at the point where footpaths cross, so it's more of a way marker, but it still went in because we like it. We needed somebody to beat the bounds, because we couldn't go around and do it, because we can't walk through quarries and over private land and across fields and stuff. But there is something that could.
That would be a giant.
Of course it'd be a giant, but an ash tree giant.
Well, this is the finished picture of the ash giant. It's a detail of it anyway. But along the way, I made some other pictures, and I thought I'd show them here. And this is the first one I made. When Suzanne and Jake showed me the ash giant, it was across the fields from higher up, and this is how he looked, marching along the hedgerow, looking at all the fields and walking along the boundary. And that was the first one. The second one I did was a quick sketch, but actually when I look at him here in comparison, he looks a little bit defeated. He doesn't look quite as happy as he does on the first one. He looks as if it's rather a task to walk along the boundaries, and I don't feel that the ash giant does feel it's a task. It's what he lives for, it's what he enjoys. And then the third one I made was this one here, which is misty. I think he looks a little bit more majestic here. I feel that that's captured his personality better. And he's marching along there in the mist, along the hedgerows, looking at the boundaries. And Suzanne and Jake have made a lovely song, Beating the Bounds, and that is all about the ash giant. And then the final one, Suzanne sent me another photograph, which was from a different angle, looking up. And here he is. So this is the completed one. This is the final one I've done. Looking up and seeing his antlers, he's looking out across the fields, walking along the hedgerows, and just generally keeping an eye on everything, making sure everything's okay. And there he is, the ash giant.
across this land, ivy clad with staff in hand, ash tree antlers on his head. I'm off to beat the bounds, he said. He has no need for maps or plans, he sees it all from where he stands. Follow the brook to Fairy Glen, up the hill and onward then. He'll meet you at the muster hole, past Wilmore Pool, three-forked pole, stopping at the stooping stone, cross the coal pits down for home. Streams and roads, near oak trees, standing stones, ancient markers on the ground show the way to beat the bounds. Down the hill and through the goss, to stand where stream and pathway cross, lower Crowsfoot, Scarlet Moor, Pikey Peace and Aldborough, across the fields and through the wood, up to where the mill once stood, past St. Peter's, follow the brook, turning round to take a look. Pools and pathways, streams and roads, near oak trees, standing stones, ancient markers on the ground show the way to beat the bounds. Twigs as fingers, roots as feet, step by step and beat by beat, ivy tendrils curled around, his staff placed gently on the ground. Streams and roads, near oak trees, standing stones, ancient markers on the ground show the way to beat the bounds.